Imagine the pain of that mother whose son is called Abdullah, and now he calls himself Abdullah Crow because he believes that he's a crow, and his teacher in school and his teacher in principal says you are a crow. Imagine that mother coming to the masjid, and then the imam or the board is completely disconnected from that reality. It's so painful to see that.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Dogma Disrupted. Today we have a very special guest, Sheikh Ahmad Saleem, who is someone who's a specialist in tafsir and seerah. He has mastered the Arabic language, completed a tafsir of the Quran in various modes. He is currently the imam and resident scholar at Hamza Islamic Center in Atlanta, and he is instructor of various Islamic institutes as well. He's also the founder of Deenagers, which I think is an amazing and excellent pun, which is a safe space for teens to learn about their deen. He intends to bring his leadership experience coupled with traditional Islamic knowledge to transform Hamza Islamic Center into a forward-thinking Islamic center rooted in traditional knowledge that represents American Muslim culture. He shares a philosophy that I have, which is accepting all mainstream Sunni opinions and basing our institutions off of that. And we ask Allah to give him tawfiq. Welcome, Sheikh Ahmed, to the program.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome. Jazakallah khair for hosting me.
Wa alaikum assalam.
The only philosophy I disagree with is coffee. Coffee snobbery, or I'm gonna eliminate those people out of this. So if you're not good coffee snob, sorry, you ain't got space here.
I was gonna say, you threw me for a loop here because we've had many discussions about coffee, and
my coffee setup is set up. I need to send you the post.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I had the pleasure of meeting Sheikh Ahmed in Toronto, where he was based before he moved down to stateside. And so now, welcome to America.
Jazakallah khair. And the South welcome.
Yeah, very soft welcome, but a very, it dovetails into the sort of the theme of today's discussion. Since you've been a recent transplant to the States, the States has exploded in issues regarding gender discussion, gender ideology in public schools, the resistance to that, Muslims being at the forefront of the resistance to that. Montgomery County specifically, things are popping up all over the nation. And so that was kind of the idea behind this episode of trying to look into how students and parents, what room do they have to maneuver? What room do they have to stand up? What are the threats that are facing them? What are the rights that they're entitled to? These are all the sorts of things that we hope to. It's a huge, huge subject, but at least to start chipping away at it today. So I know that we had discussed, a skeleton of sorts of what we would talk about. And the first thing that came up was the idea of understanding or helping Muslim parents and students understand what freedoms and rights that they are entitled to, particularly the freedom of religious practice. So would you like to give us a little bit of a background about that?
Yeah, definitely, inshallah. Jazakallah khair, Imam Tom. Back when I went to high school, whether it was Canada or, that part of the world in America or now in America, what was really interesting was I still remember, I have vivid memories of praying on snow, putting our jackets out and praying Jama'ah and Jum'ah and doing 2-minute khutbahs because it's freezing. It's minus 25 degrees Celsius outside. And we would take off our jackets and we would pray because the school would not allow us to have a room.
You're going to have to translate that for us in America to Fahrenheit, by the way.
Fahrenheit. I still have my Celsius on. That's going to
be on your citizenship test.
Yes. But if we really think about it, we've gone so far that now you have spaces where you can pray. What's really interesting to see is that the next generation that is coming and the parents that are growing up that had those challenges now are not fighting for the same rights. They're not fighting. They're not sending some guys can you start a second Jummah at Masjid Hamza because our kids can't pray in the school? And I'm like,
Allahu Akbar. That is literally one of the first things that I was asked when I joined Utica about following the secondary non-normative Maliki opinion that you can have a Jummah in the time of Asr because the kids get off of school at a certain time. And my response was, seriously. And my response was, why don't they just pray in school? Right? So,
yeah.
I'm not alone.
Yeah. So the thing is, parents need to step up. Oftentimes, we all know that we're coming across this filter where if the child goes up and says, hey, this is my right, I want to talk about, how do I get a prayer room? They're usually shunned off. But if the parents get involved, And they send them, they say, I need to meet the vice principal, whichever, the last surname the vice principal is responsible for. I want to talk to the vice principal for my child, or I want to talk to the principal in this case, and saying, this is my freedom. This is, you're not allowing that freedom to be expressed. When enough parents go and speak, they have no choice left. They have no choice left because they're not, how are they going to navigate that? And alhamdulillah, this generation, I'm talking about my generation, like the ones that are in 40s and 50s that came 20, 30 years ago, as they have a lot more to give in these things. So they have to stand up for those kids and the rights of those kids, rather than putting pressures on mosques, because we are living in a time where freedom of religion is part and parcel of the society. That's the claim, at least, right?
Right. And it might be under attack, but at least on the books, we still have it. So let's just, to be super, super clear to the listener, first fundamental right is that you have the right to pray in school. Nobody can tell you that you can't pray in school.
100%.
And that prayer, whether it's an individual prayer, if we're talking about making dhuhr, whether it's a communal prayer, if we're talking about even having some accommodation for Jummah, right? There is no leg to stand on for a school to tell you that you can't pray.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
or not give you the time off to pray.
Or not give you even time off. And that's so almost like a second thing. So situation number one is praying in school. Okay. Situation number two is having the right to be pulled out of school to go attend the masjid. Let's say that you don't have enough people to justify a Jummah, right? That it is your constitutional right to have your parents or a guardian pull you out of school so that you can go to the masjid and attend Jummah prayer.
And it's the school's responsibility to provide you the support you need for the work missed.
Right. So it's not
the school
all on you now to chase them around and say, what did I miss? What did I miss? Because, on the real, and this is a good actually illustration, because there is a difference between the rights that are on the books and then how individual teachers and administrators will attempt to punish students or obstruct. Right? Like we recently had that situation in Utica, where there is a family that lived down in Hamilton where Colgate University is. And so for them, it's a bit of a drive. But I advocated heavily for the family to do exactly that, to, pull them out for Jummah because they were feeling very isolated in their area. They had a great experience, but they told me afterwards that the teachers were trying to disincentivize it and obstruct it in every way possible. Wow. They were telling the students that, well, you're going to miss a lot. Well, I don't know. And then every sort of opportunity afterwards, and we've seen this with the LGBTQ curriculum, so we'll come around to that eventually. Yeah. Once the kid comes back to school, the teacher is sort of punishing the student, either socially or otherwise, by if there's anything that the student has a question in class or they're not clear on something, then the attitude is, well, you shouldn't have missed Friday, you shouldn't have missed class. Now you're behind. Told you exactly. So those are, I guess, maybe people would categorize those as microaggressions, but they're really, really important when it comes to realizing what students and parents are up against and the sort of conniving ways that individuals that are unsupportive can actually attempt to dissuade and disincentivize people from exercising their rights.
It's important to also understand, right? Like what's happening here is, that whole postmodernism, the loss of individual and universal, that whole concept, right? That, basically like humanity, regardless of your race, gender, class, sex, whether it is individual or at a universal level, they're all myths. Mm-hmm. So the root cause of that is like those people that are now school teachers have come out of these universities that have taught them this postmodernistic law. Like it doesn't matter if you individually believe in something. It doesn't matter if a universal truth existed. All of those things, that every type of collective truth that existed is up for grabs because there is no fact. Mm-hmm. Right. And then that's where it's coming from. Right. So they don't even realize that at the teachers, like I want to be a little bit like sympathetic to the one at the teacher. They went to school systems that actually completely brainwashed them. Mm-hmm. So they don't know another reality. They know only this reality. And most of them's like, yeah, I was a Christian. I was a Jew. My parents were Jew. I don't adhere to anything. And that's where it's coming from. So when they see somebody oh, there is an absolute truth, and I'm talking about salah, and I'm talking about a fact, and I believe in a reality that is alternate to theirs. They're like, wait a minute, but these are not factuals. These are collective understandings that can be questioned.
Right. Yeah. Usually from my experience, it comes in two vectors. That's one vector, definitely the whole, either like, it usually, at least the language that's deployed from the people is that this is a violation of secularism. And actually there was some bad press from people in our area up in central New York that tried to get some sort of accommodation to pray. And then there were these hit pieces and like op-eds and things like that were basically like, oh, this is not the separation of church. A lot of misunderstanding about what it means to have a quote unquote separation between church and state. And then there's, I think, another vector, which is, the United States is a large place, and you're in the South. So, you definitely understand that there are some people that are committed to a type of Christianity where they see something that is just out of prejudice against Islam and Muslims. And I think that here's Sharia law is knocking at the door.
Sharia
right?
law.
and so
we got Sharia kids in school.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, Islamics, right? Or whatever they want to call people. But so that is a very real thing. So what would we tell a Muslim parent or a Muslim student if they find that they're attempting to exercise the rights that they have on the books, but they find themselves obstructed by a particular individual, whether it's a teacher or something like that?
First, I would say that, know your rights. So read up, educate yourself what, your rights are, because you can't really help. You can't really stand up for if you don't know anything. So most of the parents, you can't go in this conversation, or a student, you cannot go in this conversation feeling that you don't, not having enough information. That's number one. Number two is seek for help. So your local imams who are born and raised in America would be a great resource to have. Like, the one call from them can make a huge difference. I've gotten involved in one particular case where, just called, hey, I'm going to use the word Ben just for this, Benjamin or whatever. Hey, Ben, this is 1, 2, 3. And the guy's like, oh, I didn't know that. Nobody explained it to me. Oh, okay, absolutely no problem. Sure. They can leave whenever, as long as they can come back in 10 minutes. Like, it was just a matter of that communication to explain to them in 10, 15 minutes in layman terms why this is important. Right. The third is reaching out to those, like in Canada, we have NCCM, in South, you have CARE. If it goes to that level where you feel like your rights are completely being violated and you're not being heard, then reaching out to those chapters and a letter from them can also do it. But silence is not the option.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important, specifically about, I think the sort of flow chart or contingency plan for action shows us that the importance of being involved in your child's education, period. And developing relationships, right? Because you don't want it to have to get to the level of like, you're now got some disgruntled opposition in the school system and now you have to try to go over their heads or whatever. A lot of these things, like you said, can be resolved with a phone call. They can be resolved with a face-to-face meeting. And unfortunately, you don't want it to get to the point where this is the first time that you've even like popped in to say hello, right? Like this is the first time that your kid's teacher has heard from you, or the first time that the principal has heard from you. And it's because there's a problem and now you're seeking redress, right? As much as things have a legal rule-based dimension to them, they always have that interpersonal dimension to them as well. And so if you're actively cultivating relationships, you go to the open house in the beginning of the year, your kids' teachers, the administrator, they would recognize you, right? If you showed up, they recognize your face, you recognize them. I think it's a lot easier sledding, right? If that's sort of your situation, than if you're just completely hands off, you have no idea what's going on in your kid's education. And then now you're going to try to just advocate and secure this kind of right that you think you might have.
With the cloak of a religion. So now that's even a second, like you're unknown, and in a second unknown for them that, wait a minute, now this is like a overly religious person, as opposed to getting involved in their education, academics, this, that, personal fights, school, sports, and all of these things. They're like, oh, wait a minute, this is an involved student, involved parent with the student, as opposed to, why is he getting involved only in religion?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. And so this becomes, that we're all talking about the issue of prayer here, which is something that, Muslim students have been dealing with for a long time. Now there's an added urgency to knowing your rights, because a lot of times people are going to bet on you not knowing your rights, just like police officers can do, school boards and teachers the same, or they don't know the rights either, right? Now, all of this stuff has interpersonal relationships, etc., all has increased urgency or heightened urgency, because now within the last however much time, it's been different depending on where you are, we have an extremely aggressive imposition of ideology that's being forced down even at the elementary school level with LGBTQ curriculum. What's going on? What are some of the things that you've seen down in Atlanta? We can talk about some of the other things that are going on nationally. Why does this now deliver even more urgency to knowing our rights and taking an active role in our kids' education?
There was a really interesting video that's going viral. I don't know if you saw that black grandfather speaking up at a southern. I don't think it's Atlanta, but it's definitely south. So it's like he had a southern accent, and you saw that? He's like, it's called Jesus Pride Month. Yeah, he's like, welcome to Jesus Pride Month. And then he's like, but he takes a really interesting, he said that, it was really interesting. He made a comment saying that the fact that the entire community is engulfed in this and God is allowing this to happen, it's already an indication that God has already passed a judgment against these people. And I was just taken aback, because like, لِمَا تَعِذُونَ قَوْمًا اللَّهُ مُهْلِكُهُم. Like, why are you warning? And Allah's like, there's a judgment that's being passed, that, go ahead, have at it, do whatever you want, because there's an end coming, there's a time coming. So it was really interesting to see that they were able to do that. And this in Atlanta is playing out in a different way, because I live in the most liberal county in Atlanta, Fulton County. So it's like the largest county in Georgia. And it goes from all the way to the airport to hour and a half north. You just keep driving. Where I live, hour and 20 minutes. It's still the same county. I'm right at the edge of it. And it's the most liberal county. So it's really interesting. You step out of that county, and where you are in Forsyth County, you have a completely different Target. You go into Target, you go into Walmart. There's no flags, none of that. You come to Fulton County Target, it's like everywhere. Like, and people are starting to speak up against that. So now, even the other day when I was coming out of the masjid, there was like this anti flag, they were holding these flag against the pride, and people were like, the entire road, they had like people lined up protesting against it publicly, which for me was almost never happens in Canada. But this year is the first year, which is the exception, by the way, with everybody, there was lots of protests against that, which is nice, that there's at least some balancing of the conversation, right? We're not trying to be bigots here, like just to, no hatred here. It's just saying, do what you want to do, but let us do what I want to do, and don't shove what you're doing on us. Like, that's the simple thing here.
In fact, the bigotry almost is in the opposite direction, because the move that's being made is saying that to morally object is to be filled with hatred and to actually do violence, whether the violence is an internalized psychological violence or makes you liable to an external threat, right? So to equate those two things, it's like very, very far apart. Like me saying, hey, this is not morally okay, to I want to see you hurt, right? Those are two very far away things. And what has made, I think, force the issue is that those two far points on the spectrum are being collapsed into a singularity, and said that to say one is to say the other. And now everybody like, whoa, wait a second. Like, that has such far-reaching consequences on, if we're going to run society like that, like seriously. And we've seen this when the Equality Act was proposed, and thankfully it hasn't made it through Congress, but it would literally mean the end of masajid, like in the United States of America. It would literally mean the end of Islamic schools, 501c3. Like, we literally can't exist as a faith group if you're going to say that. Even to say that we're morally opposed to this means that we want violence to happen to somebody, or etc. So, very, very disturbing times. But like you said, very encouraging.
It's very encouraging too, right? Very. And have you read the book Cynical Theories? I think you're the one who recommended it to me, right?
Did I?
No.
I can't. I don't think it was me.
I don't think so.
I might have recommended it to you, but I haven't read it yet, because someone recommended it to me.
I remember when we met at Starbucks, you recommended it, and I actually picked it up and I read it. And it talked about, like, so basically, like, the two key principles. And if we want to understand where this is all coming down from, right? Like this, what we're seeing is the fruits and the branches, but the root of it is that skepticism about whether objective truth is even attainable. Mm-hmm. That's where everything is coming down to, right? The summary is that it's not about what is, but it's what it ought to. Mm-hmm. Right? Like if you were to summarize. So right now, the whole focus is, it doesn't matter what is, it doesn't matter what the data shows. It doesn't matter how much of the data shows that, transgenderism or any type of this ideology is not serving those kids. It's what it ought to, right? And who cares about the facts and realities on the ground? Right. And it was really interesting to read that book,
I'll just clarify, by ought to, we're not saying sort of like a moral dimension, which is bringing us more into sort of traditional society. What we're talking about by ought to is autonomy, right? We're talking about the full logical conclusion of, I own myself, the best good is autonomy, and therefore the most precious and sacred thing is to do whatever it is that occurs to me to do, to be, to feel, to think, whatever. I'm going to identify myself with all those desires, and I'm going to, I have to actualize them. I have to bring them into reality. And if I don't, then actually it's going to be some sort of internal dissonance or et cetera.
And it's really interesting. All the clashes are happening where there is some form of hierarchy, like value hierarchy. Right? So for us, it's Quran and Sunnah. For somebody else, like the Sikhs, they're also, in certain parts of the world are opposing to this. It's their books and their leaders. So if you look at it, it's also the second part. The cynical theory says this: whenever it sees a structured value-based hierarchies, everything that is being worked upon is to destroy that hierarchy. So there is no way for us to be able to ascertain these truths.
Sure. Yeah, no, the idea of hierarchy is something that I think the modern world, the modern liberal values bristles at entirely. Because the idea, there's no sort of allowance, and this is sort of a more theoretical discussion maybe for another episode, but
Inshallah.
there's no allowance for a moral and dignified inhabitation of hierarchical roles. Right. So there's, a lot of this comes back to the discussion of privilege. And it's so crazy to see how the enshrining of the language of privilege, and privilege is something that's problematic in the earlier 2000s, has led us to where we are now, because the assumption behind that is to wield power is unfair, that power itself is not a moral thing. They say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is very different from the Islamic paradigm, which believes that there is just power. Sure, there's unjust power as well, right? But the Prophet ﷺ wielded power, right? You could say the Quraysh had privilege, okay? To be an Arab in Medina or in especially Mecca was privilege. And yet, what were the responses that were divine responses to this, sort of society which had privilege and had power? It wasn't to destroy all hierarchy. It wasn't to destroy all privilege or to destroy all power. It was the moral redemption of those individuals in their roles, which then allowed a just power to be wielded that bore fruits of justice for everybody. So a very, very different sort of schema of looking at things. Now what you're saying is that we're in this sort of situation where 10 years ago we were talking about privilege. Now we're talking about, yes, we're still talking about privilege, but it's been expanded. So to be a straight cis het male, quote unquote, if we, I don't believe in any of those things, like how they're constructed, but going with their logic, like that's the worst possible thing that you could be, because you have the most amount of privilege, you have the most amount of power, and you're not even possibly able to use that power and privilege really in a good way without sort of just like wringing your hands and dragging your face through the mud and letting, people who are supposedly more oppressed than you, run the show. So
yeah, and I think what you're saying is very interesting, right? Because like the summary of it is like what they believe about power is that inherently power is dangerous and unreliable. At the end of the day, right? That's the conversation, right? And actually, it mentions that in the cynical theory. There's an entire chapter about the power of language. And it says that they want to not only take away powers in hierarchy, but they want to even take away power from within the language. and that's hence the whole pronoun, and like, because that's power. Like, it's just when you read it, it's like, some of the most important binaries for us is like up and down, left and right. Like, these are, and same male and female. These are very important. There was an art, this person I spoke about, or I wanted to talk about, was this professor, Colin Wright. Have you seen some of his work?
No, I don't.
So yeah, so Colin Wright is like an atheist, nothing to do with religion, purely science. And look at what they have done to him. Like, he lost his tenured position. He's coming out publicly talking about it just purely from a science perspective. And he's like, now there's like these lawsuits, I think, against Wikipedia to change the definition of male and female. And he's like, and then the guy who's talking about the Wikipedia is like, it's not possible because it's like structured on 1 or 0 in like the entire structure. So it's not even possible in Wikipedia to be able to change that. And look at these people like Colin Wright. And I tell parents to equip themselves with that type of knowledge, because that when you go and have a conversation and they're going to be like, oh, your child is now suffering with X, whatever, they're going to, right? They're going to present their worldview as an absolute truth, knowing that they have completely disregarded facts. They've completely based it on that one singular experiment done by John Money with those 2 Canadian kids, and build this entire thing on that, and complete disregard of facts. So when you listen to somebody like Colin Wright, I think that's something the parents should definitely go look him up. He's an atheist. He's talking about religion, but he talks about the gender from a scientific he has like 20-minute videos where he breaks it down for you. Understand that. Equip yourself with that knowledge, right? Because that's scientific knowledge in the scientific world, which is being somehow now, filtered. So I think coming back to that, there is a fact, our pedagogy, or, our, epistemology of knowledge is, there is haqq and batil and all of these things, right? And that's what they're basically trying to.
Yeah, no, extremely important. And that brings us back, I think, to the focus of definitely this conversation, trying to think about parents and students, in school, because when it comes to, all the things that are fast unfolding, there's a lot of options for what discourse you could deploy, right? If we want, like, which hill do we die on when it comes to you're standing up in front of a school board meeting, for example, and these things have already been rolled out in your school. The opt-out option has been cynically rescinded, like it was in Montgomery County, without any sort of, shura, any sort of, democratic process or anything like this, completely unilateral. What's the strategy? What are the tactics, and what's maybe the most useful discourse to use? Because if we go up there, like you and I can agree, obviously in a conversation about, the different intellectual history, and then we have the separation of fact and value, and we have all these sorts of things that are happening, but when you go up in front of a school board, or people who believe in this sort of stuff, you're not necessarily going to win the day, at least win what you want, on saying, well, this is just a fact and this is the science or whatever. So what should parents, do you think, really focus in on if they find themselves in that sort of scenario?
Okay. So I want to first, before we get to that, there's the Gareth Webb School incident, which didn't get much coverage. It's one of these incidents that actually sets for us how we navigate this beautifully. Right. So there's the poster that's posted. Last year, Pride Month, they put sister and sister, expressively showing affection and, kissing in that picture. One of the sisters in Gareth Webb,
2 Muslim, so just so everyone's clear, 2 Muslim sisters with hijab kissing each other on a poster for LGBTQ, whatever it was,
in every school of Peel region. So heavily Muslim. Peel is the most dense Muslim school board in Canada. Okay.
Quick question on your way. Why do you think they select Muslim figures and 2 Muslim sisters in hijab specifically for their thing?
First, hijab is the representation of Islam. Our sisters, when they go out, I have, so much sometimes affection and pride when I see another sister walking in Target or working in Walmart and putting that hijab on. You are doing da'wah to every single one around.
Yeah.
And the second part is they know that this is the symbol of Islam and they are not accepting this.
Right.
So we need to attack the symbol.
They're actively trying to undermine our morality while keeping our symbolism. So that's basically what's happening.
Yeah, 100%. Subhanallah. So what she did is she went to the school principal and we brought her in and she gave us a speech to our students in our masjid and they were so inspired. She said, look, I just took a brother with me because I needed somebody along. So the vice president of MSA, the MSA was hands off. MSA is like, we don't want to help. But one of the guys in the MSA said, I'll help. They went there. She said, I'm hurt. The principal can't take that because they're trained by saying if a child says, I am hurt, it sends all of these triggers. And she said, I feel unsafe. And I feel that I have been neglected from the school. I've been removed from the student body.
Erased. Allahu Akbar.
Erased. Oh my God. She said,
you use their language against them.
You use their language against them. Here's the interesting thing. So I asked her, I'm like, started justifying, because when it comes to religious, exclusion, they want justifications. And she said, I just became a broken parrot. I was just like, I feel hurt. I feel neglected. I feel omitted. I feel not accepted. They're like, but why? She's like, I feel hurt. So she just kept repeating to the extent that the principal, she said, how can we fix this? She said, the only way we can fix this is you're going to remove these posters because those posters have singled me out as a hijabi. And this is not what I stand for. And this is pinnacle of Islamophobia. And that's when she said, posters have to be removed and a public apology to all the Muslim students. There are 700 students in the school. 700 out of the 1,200 bodies, 700 are Muslims. We all are offended. And she's like, no, I don't think all of you are offended. She's like, trust me, we're offended. They're just not coming out. So, okay, I will apologize. And then she says, how do you want to do the apology? She's like, I need a public apology. She's like, the school board policies don't allow me to publicly apologize for religious offenses. Wow. So she's like, what can you do? She's like, I can do private apologies. So she apologized to, I think, 300 or 350 students. They all lined up. She came out. One by one for 2 hours.
Wow.
And then this girl did a silent walkout. Next day, she said, I'm doing a silent walkout.
If I can pause you just for a second. I just want the listener just to register the fact, listen to the discourse of what the principal, tried to deploy when she said, okay, so she's using the offense tactic. She even used sort of the Islamophobia. And look at how quickly she attempted to divide and conquer by saying they're not all offended. There are some Muslims who agree with this. There are some Muslims who do this. This is a tried and true tactic that people attempt to use to divide us and conquer us it's the good Muslim, bad Muslim game.
Yes.
Right? Where now you're going to have
practicing, non-practicing.
Yes, exactly. Here's the right kind of Muslim that we want, completely, ascribed and submissive to liberal modern values, right? And anybody else who's not, they're not understanding their tradition correctly, or they're being, reactionary or
not Canadians.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want the listener to be very, very aware.
Beautiful point.
Extremely relied upon tactic in order to split people. So go ahead. So then she
and then she does a silent walkout where even the lesbians and the gays showed up in support.
Wow.
And there's a clip that went around viral, and basically they took down all these clips from everywhere, right? So Instagram posted, I think Sheikh Ammar Shukri posted, I think they took it down from like anywhere that silent walkout was. And basically she had a statement which was drafted by somebody who's in human rights and activism, a very nice brother. He drafted the statement. Every student was told that the media is going to be there. You're not going to say anything. It's a silent walkout. And I think except exception of like 50, 60 students that wanted to be part of it. There were around like 600 plus. They all walked out on that day. And guess what? The media completely hushed this entire, because it was a win.
Of course.
And it was a win at a level that never seen. So the lesson for this is the policies are written where a student is always right. So we have to have this pride in our, and I use the word pride purposely. They need to feel proud that they're Muslims. They need to feel proud that they're Americans or Canadians. They need to feel this pride that I belong in this country. I was born in there. I'm not going anywhere. This is my country.
Mm-hmm.
And this is my right of freedom. And now you've hurt me. The beauty is, because of this liberal stuff, you don't even have to justify why you're hurt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You just need to say, I'm hurt. And it triggers a whole bunch of systems that can then come back to protect us.
Yeah, it forces them into an awkward position where they now have to choose between different types of hurt and prioritize
different types of hurt. Yeah,
it reminds me, and I always come back to this point from the Sirah. It's very, very fascinating to me, where when two scenarios, like one when the boycott was happening in the Meccan period, right, and you had even some of the idolaters who were against the boycott.
Yeah.
Right. Because it was against their kind of whatever was their traditional values of tribalism. And obviously Islam has trenchant critiques of tribalism. However, the situation was manufactured in such a way as to almost use what they believed against them. Right. It's like now you have people who are actually calling for the end of the boycott, not because they're ready to become Muslims, but because of their tribal sort of sympathies.
Sympathy.
Right? And, it wasn't the only sort of rivulet in the stream that ended the boycott, but it was there. And then later, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and you have the situation where they put the Quraysh in such an awkward spot because their entire legitimacy is based off of protecting the pilgrims and facilitating the Hajj. Well, now your sworn enemy has come defenseless for pilgrimage,
for Hajj or Umrah.
Now you have a conflict of interest. You've forced the issue where they have to choose. If they can slaughter them all right there, and in doing so lose their legitimacy and lose like their honor, and everyone's going to hate their guts and pretty much be plotting for their downfall, probably, right? Or they maintain a sort of the whole reason why they're there, and they facilitate the Hajj in some way and get totally embarrassed because it's their sworn enemy that's coming to do it. Mm-hmm. Right. So we've talked about these on this particular podcast and in some previous episodes, the difference between deploying a discourse versus believing in it fully. Right.
Yeah.
And so when we're saying in these situations, you have to be smart, you have to be very savvy. It's not that we're saying that we believe in the whole liberal paradigm of the hurt and the grievance politics and all this other stuff. No, we don't want to be constituted by that. That's not what we're about. But you can deploy it in a very sort of practical and instrumental way in order to get your rights. Similarly to how the fuqaha say that rishwa, right, bribery is haram, no doubt. The person who gives it, the person who receives it, etc., etc. But if you're in a situation where the only way to get your right is by paying a rishwa, by paying a bribe, then, it's permissible for you. You don't like it. You don't like it, but that's there. So we almost have a similar situation where we have these discourses that are liberal discourses, but they're so perhaps we could say mutually contradicting, or there's so much room in them for interpretation and for playing games and stuff like that you can actually use them against the people who are trying to trample on your rights and trying to kind of target you as Muslims.
And these are systems you're in, right? So you're already in the school system. You're not going to be able to go out of the school system if you've chosen to have your kids in the school system. So this really helps. And I think also training our kids to speak up to these things. I think the other part of this is, parents not showing up at those voting meetings, not knowing when those meetings are happening, not being part of the superintendents of the schools, and not even participating in that election process when that school body. Sure, you don't want to go into politics, you don't want to go into Congress, but there's Muslim kids that are going to go to these schools. This is how those policies, you should be on the platform if you have enough Muslims around Why is it that no Muslim is represented on there, especially when there's, a school that has like 600-700 Muslims, right? So I think getting involved in that is also definitely really interesting.
That's a huge point. And I'll jump in just to say that, a lot of people have reservations about getting involved in politics at the national level. And I totally can respect and understand those reservations, because at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot of difference between, let's say, foreign policy or some of the policies of Democrat, Republican, or left and right. You're going to compromise. Your tax dollars are going to bombing your brothers and sisters abroad. I get all of that. I totally respect, even if it's not my position all the time. I respect somebody who, on principle, says, national politics, it's too messy. I don't want that on my scale of deeds. But the local level is completely different. Right? Talking about, you can be registered to vote and vote in a school board election. And a lot of the times, the amount of votes that it takes to swing a school board election are very, very few. We're talking like 50 to 100 to 150 votes can totally decide who's going to be there, representing your kid, looking after your kids, sort of, and it doesn't have to do anything with foreign policy. It doesn't have to anything to do with any of the things that are, necessarily against our deen. So it's low hanging fruit. Right, it's a very easy thing to get involved.
Even municipal politics, right? Those are where Muslims should be involved, and it's kind of like Hakim ibn Hizam, and when you talked about the story. There were 5 people that broke that boycott.
Right. Yeah.
Total 5. So it's same here. Like, it doesn't take much for us to be able to change all of that. I want to also pivot to this element, which is so as somebody who's been dealing with a lot of these parents whose kids have supposedly come out, or whose kids have been indoctrinized with this. They have this thing now. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's called the rapid onset of gender dysphoria.
Yep.
Yeah, it's like the number of cases that rise in June is like some psychiatrist. She was working in the hospital, and she used to come to my masjid. She said, Imam, like, the minute June comes, it's just skyrockets, because she's like, every single one of them had another form of a mental health issue.
SubhanAllah.
Right? And I've posted a link for you guys in there. There's an article called I Thought I Was Saving Trans Kids. Worth reading that article. Here's a nurse that believes in this. She's all up for this. And now, after serving, I don't know, whatever, X number of years, she comes out and she's like, every single one of those kids we helped, we knew that they had depression, they had anxiety. We knew these things were happening, and we just overlooked them. So coming back to the parents who have to deal with this trauma, it's because if they go to the doctors, what kind of parent are you? You don't want to affirm your child. You're going to be responsible for your child's suicide.
Yeah.
So imagine that trauma. Imagine the trauma of their child being taken away. Imagine the trauma of finding no mental health resources out there, no psychiatrist, no therapist that is willing to affirm your feelings and your pain. Imagine, and this is serious. Now it has gone to the level that, they were closing down these groups. So now on Facebook, there are these private groups of Muslim parents whose kids have either transitioned or, lesbian, gay, whatever this is. And they're not finding any support. And there's a vetting process. So I did like a small Zoom call with these parents. And they were like, because as part of teenagers, all these kids would come and talk to me. And in an anonymous manner, I had figured out an anonymous way to get those concerns, and eventually they would build enough trust with me, and they would come and discuss this. We're talking about super practicing sisters, and most of them are girls, by the way. Most of them are super, like a practicing sister. I could not imagine that this sister is going through this. Like, she prays, she reads Quran, and then she comes, and I'm like, in one conversation, I'm not a mental health specialist. I'm like, you need help, sister. Like, she's a 14-year-old, 15. I'm like, you need help. And wherever she goes for help, wherever parents take her, it's like, oh, you're in the wrong body. You're in the wrong body. You're in the wrong body.
That's extremely significant, because, we live in, I think, a time of mental health crisis. And there's so many reasons for that. Like, we could talk, that could be an entire episode just talking about the reason or the reasons why our youth struggle so much with mental health. The breakdown of the family, the loss of purpose, not having very meaningful sort of things to look forward to, the removal of rites of passage. There's a million things that we could talk about. And I think what you're highlighting, and it's a really, really significant point, is that in our current society, every single symptom, every single time a young person that's around puberty age has something with their mental health, the systems and the professionals are going to say, I know what that is. That's gender dysphoria. You're in the wrong body. As opposed to all of the myriad things that it could be, and even not just one particular thing. A lot of these things might be sort of like threshold, like one thing is the straw that breaks the camel's back, and there's really all these sort of underlying issues that compound upon each other. And we live in a societal moment where psychologists and school counselors and school teachers and administrators and even doctors are basically ready to just, as soon as something comes through the door, I know what that is. That's this thing. Let's put you on puberty blockers. Let's help you transition. Let's help people, quote unquote, accept. Right? It's madness. It
is madness. I'd read a paragraph here. It says the girls that came to us had many issues, including depression, anxiety, ADHD, eating disorders, obesity. Many were diagnosed with autism and had autism-like symptoms. A report last year that was published said 1/3 of these patients that were referred, they were on an autism spectrum. And this response is, let's not affirm gender dysphoria. Let's not treat it because they don't believe in gender dysphoria now, because if you say it's a mental disorder, so they're like, oh, let's remove that completely. In 2055, I think it was removed, or 2015. So from the DSM, and now it is like, it's like, oh, you got a wrong body, and we need to start this entire process of helping and changing you. And my concern is the conversations about parents. How do masajids, and I want to talk to the masajids, we play a role here.
Yeah.
Like in the last khutbah, I talked about LGBT, and parents were the ones who were hurt, loved it. The ones that said, why is he talking about this? I'm like, your kid is 10.
We want it to go away. People want it to go away.
Yeah, people want it to go away. It's not going away. It's not going away. I mean, like, if that bill passes, your massage is not going to be what you think it is.
That's
right? And so I want to talk to the massages for a second and say that, we play a role, which is whether we bring Muslims who are trained in psychotherapy and these things, they're also trained in Islamic classical sciences, and they have to start offering communal, private, kind of like Alcohol Anonymous, so that nobody knows that they're parents. And it cannot be done in a masjid, but it has to be spearheaded by either masjids or institutes. And this is a big issue. Those 40, 50 parents that I had a Zoom call in, they all had their, I think 4 of them or 5 of them, cameras on. Everybody had their cameras off. So when I pinged and I said, I would love to see all of you guys, they all said, we cannot, because we're crying deep down inside, because this is the first time somebody has taken somebody that we look up to has affirmed our feeling. And I was literally taken aback for days that, imagine the pain of that mother whose son is called Abdullah, and now he calls himself Abdullah Crow because he believes that he's a crow, and his teacher in school and his teacher in principal says you are a crow, and you are going, and imagine that mother coming to the masjid, and then the imam or the board is completely disconnected from that reality.
Right.
It's so painful to see that, our ummah going through that.
Yeah, subhanAllah. No, and I think both for youth and parents, they get driven to other circles, right? When we don't address it in the masjid, and we don't address it, people have basic needs, and they're going to go wherever they feel they have to go to meet them. I mean, and may Allah make the masajid places of refuge and understanding, and also remediation.
Yeah, and my sheikh used to say that these masajids are supposed to be hospitals for the spiritually sick, and not clubs for the pious.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
right? Like I'm paraphrasing from his Arabic to English.
If we were Christians, we'd put that on the marquee out front. Our marquee game is not like the Christians. Christians' marquee game is on point.
Yeah. So anyhow, inshallah. The other, so here's some material that the parents can equip themselves with, right? There's a book that's coming out. I've already pre-ordered it in July. It's by Mariam Grossman. She is the one that actually, she's the one that rang the bell and the warning about this way early. It's like in 2009, she wrote the book saying, "You're teaching my kids what?" That's the book she wrote. Then she is writing this book called Lost in Trans Nation. And it's about how do children and parents navigate what type of words you need to say and speak when you come into these. So every scenario that you're going to unfold, she has given us resources where parents can equip themselves with the right type of verbiage or lawyers or whatever, so that you don't get into that spiral and you don't get into dragged into this. And as a parent, knowing your right, because oftentimes ignorance is what they feed on, especially within the Muslim community, because parents don't know their rights. You know that you can take out your child from any class if you feel like, as a parent, until they're 18. That's your right in this part. It doesn't matter. You're like, my child is not attending this. And they cannot force your child to attend if you, as a parent, you say that.
I might just add real quick, which is the importance also for all those listening in trying to re-corral gender and sex ideology into sexual education, as opposed to letting it permeate every single subject, because that makes the opt-out option
more
meaningless. Basically. You can't opt out of anything if you're getting assaulted by LGBTQ propaganda, which is what it is, in math class or in science class or whatever. But if we're able to push it back into sexual education, then that's something that we can meaningfully opt out of.
And how is that coming in maths? Is like, I was helping my daughter, grade 11 math. Mark and John went out for dinner. They booked a motel room. Like, look at, like, this is a math problem about how do you split. And I was like, why is this entire, like, so I questioned, and so as a parent, I called the principal. I said, who is writing this? Because why are we pushing this? This is a very small sliver of a society. What happened to heteronormativity? What happened to just being, mother and father went out, and they're like, oh, the other people feel neglected and left out. I said, well, they can get that in their sex education, not in maths. There's no reason to create math as a political agenda, or science for that.
Organizations like GLAAD, are very instrumental. That's one of their goals, is to increase representation in nonsensical ways, right? Because if you look at actual representation in society, it's very little. Yet I recall that they had set a goal, I believe, for 2020 to be represented in 20% of all media. I don't know how they figure that out, but movie characters, television, et cetera, et cetera. And once we got to 2020, they found that they had already surpassed that goal. So instead of being content with 20% as a fifth, it's very hefty. Way overrepresented already. The goal they set for 2030 was 30%, right? So I don't understand where it belies the fact that this is just about being recognized. Like, this is way beyond that. This is about imposition. This is about forcing other people to assent to an entire worldview, an entire theology, we could say. It's not simply about being accepted, or else this would have been much more limited and modest in its aims.
Yeah. And I think also the other element, also when you talked about this funding and all of that, I read an article would mention that, there's like a budget that they have for different sections. Like, okay, this is how much we're going to spend on Muslims, this is how much we're going to spend on the Black community. And, I was in a Yaqeen meeting in Toronto, and we were having this conversation. I don't know, were you there for that? I don't think you were there for that.
No,
you were not there for that. So Imam Ibrahim Hindi was there, Sheikh Umar Suleiman was there, a few of us. And over there, I think they talked about that, let's look at the money that they're going to spend in America on Blacks.
Yeah.
Do you know, like 70% of that is being spent in Atlanta?
SubhanAllah. I didn't know
Yeah, because the black community on the whole is completely rejecting this notion. They're not accepting it. Christians, Muslims alike. So there's like a full agenda of how do we tackle this, right? To the extent that one of the Muslim sisters, she works in the library, and she said, Sheikh, do you know that when it comes for Ramadan, I get $10,000 to do the decoration and do an event and bring a speaker and stuff like that. When it comes to Diwali, I get like $30,000 as she's a library head, right? So she was telling me all the different religious subsectors and how much funding. And she's like, so if you were to combine everything on all China and Taiwan, all of these, subcultures that exist, and they want the minorities that want to represent, and then you look at the least amount of that minority, like the smallest minority, which is the LGBTQ community. He's like, she was like, their funding is 10 times combined all. And just for this year, in that one library, their funding was $88,000 or $90,000.
Right.
And it's incentivized in the system. Like a friend of mine, this is a joke, but a friend of mine did this. He was getting his insurance in Canada, and his insurance hiked up. So a colleague at work who happened to ascribe from this saying, why don't you just tell the insurance company you're non-binary and they'll give you a 60% discount? So a Muslim brother, he just called, and there's no verification check on this. He calls and they're like, oh, we're so sorry. 1 second. Because they have a grant for that. They can offset that.
That's extremely revealing, and I think it does.
There's bigger things here in play.
Without disregarding the folks who are honestly, genuinely struggling, because obviously there is a population that is like that. However, there is definitely no doubt that our society, again, going back to the whole conversation about privilege and power, and then looking at sort of what instant recognition and sympathy that you get for identifying in a certain way. It's definitely, there's a strong incentive to interpret whatever mental health issue you're experiencing or whatever sort of discomfort you're having in your life. There's a very strong pull to understand that as part of your sexuality or your gender. It's true. I think that there's something going on where there's a sort of anachronistic way of looking at history where, yes, in the past, and I talked with Dr. Sharif on the other episode about how there was oppression and there was vigilante violence and there were real wrongs that were committed to people who had these sorts of issues before. There's a sort of move, I think, by this movement to capitalize on the sympathy generated by those sorts of things that were more prevalent in the past, and to disregard the way in which this is the new privilege.
Yeah,
this is the new power. You're the oppressor.
There's an interesting point over here, like what you mentioned. So what is happening here? Like I want. So every single one of us, when we were growing up, like you had to. So when we're playing ball on street ball, there is a social contract there, right? Yeah. There's a dominant player. There's a second dominant. There is somebody who is going to be the pawn, like those social contracts. And what was happening was, as we were growing up, we didn't have access to this. Mm-hmm. So you had to negotiate, and I mentioned this point, like the PAJ, he points out that every single interaction from the minute the child is born, he is negotiating social contracts, and he's trying to rise the hierarchy or trying to fit in at the level, and that negotiation is taking place. Mm-hmm. For those who were weaker in their negotiations, they would get community support, they would get parental push, they would get, go and attend some taekwondo, build your confidence, come back and negotiate this contract. Now, what is happening is, PAJ, he mentions in this, he's a psychologist, and he says that, identities that are based on questioning. So nobody likes me. I don't fit in. Where can I fit in? And when you start questioning everything, and then the society around affirms, yeah, you're right, you don't fit in. Yeah, you're right, you don't belong in this body. Yeah, you're right, you are like this. You can opt out of that hard exercise of negotiating that your contracted position in that society, and it's easier for you to resort to these. Mm-hmm. And literally a kid can walk in Like one of the doctors in the masjid was telling me, a kid can walk in and in 10 minutes, he can be off to a person for a first visit of how can we chop off your body parts.
Yeah.
10 minutes conversation, and we neglect the 14 years of experience of that parent with this child saying this is zero.
Yeah.
It's equated to zero. And Piaget says this is the root cause of all mental health crisis. This is like way back. Like you were talking about, 16, 1700. He's saying this way back. The reason we have mental health crisis is people are unable to negotiate those contracts in the society, and the systems are not in place for them to be able to help them get to a place where they're content with their social status in the society. And eventually they want to be able to create the otherness that, you're not enough. We have to create systems to make you feel enough. And that doesn't mean that we're talking about what is happening at a global system, and they're all connected right now over here, right? Like the feminist movement, the LGBTQ movement, all of these, and these activist movements. All of a sudden, where is this funding coming from? What is and there could be some genuine people in there, but the sheer amount of funding that is coming, it's all coming from pharmaceutical companies that benefit from, at the end of the day, othering or mental health crisis, and then they can go on those drugs or they can go on those.
So what we're saying is that there's a conflict of interest at play, right? Because 100%. if you are in the business, right, this is gender dysphoria is very, very good for business. You're creating lifelong patients, cutting edge surgeries, resculpting the body in all sorts of creative ways. That this is sort of very good for business. I've often reflected.
Add race to that. Oh, you're a minority, you're brown, you're black, you're Latino, you're this and that. You don't have access to, and all of this stuff. So add this, couple it with the person feels victimized completely all of a sudden, right? They feel victimized completely. We're not saying that those oppressions don't exist, but we're looking at the political reason of how politics are being used to cover these oppressions.
Right. And that's interesting also because we've started to see in the sports world how there started to be some pushback with the NHL and the MLB. There used to be pride jerseys and pride nights, and we've in the last year seen pushback on that as well. I've always kind of observed or thought that when it came to the prioritization of different sorts of minorities and their plights and their rights and advocacy, that first of all, LGBTQ is kind of the model minority when it comes to liberal values. In that it's based upon, again, that sort of realizing your autonomy. Whereas when it comes to race, your skin color, your ethnicity, yes, it's very existential to you, but it's not something that's reflective of something that you've chosen, right? And then the other thing that, you could say that, religious beliefs are chosen as well, but religious beliefs are not they're not sourced, or they don't originate in this sort of like primal urge or desire that people assume when it comes to either your gender identity or your sexuality, right? So on one hand, and that's one point, I've thought of this like that. This is what makes sympathy for LGBTQ issues like so sort of across the board, because of the values that we have at this particular historical juncture, where it is the most valiant sort of expression of the autonomous individual choosing for themselves what they're going to be, who they're going to be with, et cetera, in ways that other minorities aren't. The second thing, and I'm not sure if you want to comment before I move on.
No, go ahead. I want to hear you.
The second thing is just the sort of cost benefit analysis on the corporate end for, who am I? Like, let's say that we wanted to actually take race seriously in America. Like, we've got the history of redlining, we've got the history, obviously, of slavery, all these sorts of things. If we're going to try to set that right, what does it look like? It might look like reparations. It might look like, free tuition to colleges for a generation, or with, it's going to cost some money. Like, we're going to, like redistribution or reorganization of land and opportunities. Like, it's the serious work, right? But if we just put some rainbow flags on our, merchandise, and we're able to sell more, and we're have this month and whatever, it seems like a very, very easy win for them, right? They get to come across as being socially conscious and passionate about social justice issues by signing up to the one that I think is the least risky for them, and that is almost like the easiest to fix in some sort of way.
But that's also changing, but that's also changing. You heard about the Starbucks thing that happened 4 days ago?
Yes. Yeah, everything's changing now. It's
20, I think it was 21 states, the union representing the Starbucks employees said, you cannot post these flags anywhere.
Yeah. No, and
which for me I was just like, wait a minute, what's going on? Right. And what are you going to do now? Right?
Which shows you that where their real interests lie, right? Because if they were ideologically dedicated to this thing, then they
would have never done that.
Or all in, whatever. But the fact that they, and the MLB is the same, this is why I don't like, the big American sports leagues. It's all about the money. The second
it's all about the money,
that it becomes costly, that the cost outweighs whatever benefit that they're going to get, they're going to dump it like a hot potato. Like they're going to be so not, ambivalent to these sorts of things. It's literally just about optics.
And optics are changing, and now you are having 22 states in America that are not very pro this for now, the LGBTQ. They're like, wait a minute, we're going to lose out on the business in that world, and these people are going to completely boycott. I'll give you a real example, like a local coffee shop, right? The owner of the coffee shop was having a discussion with me saying, okay, I'm about to hire this. You as a conservative Muslim, would you come if I had anybody from that segment, right? And I said, it really doesn't bother me. As long as they're not pushing that to my face, it's their personal life.
Right.
And he was so shocked. He said, wow, because I've spoken to Christians and they said they would stop coming to my coffee shop. I thought you would be more staunch. and that's where, as Muslims, when we communicate that, if a person wants to have that lifestyle, that's to them. What is not allowed is any form, even the heteronormativity and halal form of any form of sexual display between a husband and wife is also not allowed publicly, right? So we're not against it, but just don't make those things public. Mm-hmm. That's what Islam's position is. So people would be surprised to say that, that community, we would probably be the most accommodating religious that would accommodate that, saying, as long as you don't push this agenda on my face in the masjid, don't publicly publicize, you can still come and pray in the masjid, nobody's going to bother you.
Right. Yeah, I think we could say that, both foundationally and historically, Islam respects privacy much more than Christianity does.
Christianity,
like, we're going to hold an inquisition and we're going to burn you at the stake if we find out that,
if you believe in science.
Yeah, right. Or yeah, exactly. Whatever it is for this.
Galileo or these guys.
The PDF stops at your doorstep is sort of the ethic of, we're concerned about, obviously we care about individual personal morality, but we have procedures in place where we're not going to overstep bounds of privacy. وَلَا تَجَسَّسُوا, Allah says in Surah Al-Hujurat. Right? Well, we are concerned about upholding public morality, and we're going to have boundaries and guardrails as to how involved we get in your personal life.
Definitely.
Running out of time, I'm not sure, we have just a couple more points. We were talking about empowering students now. We did kind of cover it. I'm not sure if you wanted to.
We did covered it, yeah.
And then thinking generationally, if you had any sort of...
so for sure, I would say that thinking generationally, this issue is going to impact more so my 7-year-old than my 18-year-old right now. Because in 10 years down the road, we have to start thinking these are questions that parents are asking. Do we dump public schools now? Do we go virtual? Do we do homeschooling? What do we do? Because no matter how much fight we put up, the tide, I would say we're not even at the crest of the wave right now. Right, it hasn't peaked yet. It's still going to peak. Right, if we think we have gained some ground, I think we have gained some ground for sure in the conversation. But in fairness, and again, this is not a conversation of win or lose. This is a conversation of what is being done to us is not fair.
Yeah,
we have won some ground, but I think thinking generationally for me, I would come back to these 3 questions. Right, every single child that is growing up, they're trying to ask. This is from my parenting. I have this thing called Teenage Matters. I do this workshop for parents and conversations so they understand this. And from there, we talk about this thing called identity. And your child is trying to answer this question, who am I? that who am I can be answered through books, through TV shows, and through all different forms of media nowadays, through YouTube, through Facebook scrolling, senseless Instagram, TikTok scrolling, all of these things. If we're not thinking that generally in the past, when you and I were growing up, our identity was based on the person I'm hanging out with or the friend I went to, and maybe the television show that would show up at 7:00, 7 p.m., which was already too late for you to watch TV, right? Like it's not like your kids are watching at 11:00 at night. They're answering those questions, and as parents, as institutions, as organizations, we need to think that how can we create content that can shape their identity and help them answer this question, who am I? Some of the good content that's coming out of, for example, Pakistan is something called Burqa Avenger. You should look it up. It's an Urdu cartoon, right? But it's really interesting. They've taken the concept of ilm, kitab, and ninja and fighting, and she fights with books and qalam. And but the fact that it's such a beautifully produced cartoon that my kids are in love with, right? And it's shaping their identity. So Muslims have to start thinking about creating those contents. I don't know if you saw this, I'm the Best Muslim.
No,
you don't have kids, right? So do you have kids?
I have 3 kids. Yeah,
I have 3 kids.
We just don't watch. We just don't watch television.
Okay, no. So this is I'm the best Muslim. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. So it's like every single scenario played out, and my kids love it. Right. So there are alternates about media. That's number one. How we run programming in our masajid, number 2. Number 3, how can we create, whether it is social masjids, whether it is within families, social structures, and I'm talking about things that are scheduled in your calendar, saying we're going to have a family barbecue every 5th or every bi-weekly or something at this family, and these are the 10 families that are going to work together. It takes a village to raise a kid. This village is going to be now, and that's going to be your local backyard.
Yep. Getting inside other people's homes. I always say it's like, if you only see each other in the masjid, that's not a community. You got to get in each other's homes, and that's where the bonds are going to, and I mentioned this, I think, on a previous podcast. One of my colleagues and mentors, he said that, yes, his son does go to public school and he's almost graduating, but he also is very involved in the masjid. And so he has these 2 sorts of friends. And he was very clear with his son up front. He said, those friends that you have at public school, they're your school friends. You're not going to hang out with them after school or outside of school or on the weekends. That's for your masjid friends. Your masjid friends, they are your friends, after school and whatever. It's like you can be friends with people in school, but and everyone's situation is different. But the point is thinking intentionally, thinking forward, like trying to actually create an ecosystem of faith for your kid. Where, media is one dimension, friends and influence is another dimension, mentors, is another dimension. There's so many dimensions to it. And when it comes to parenting, this is like a meta thing that every single Muslim in North America has to take seriously. You have to get in the game. You can't just watch from the sidelines. When it comes,
you can't be bystanders anymore.
You can't be a bystander anymore. We don't have that luxury. Not anymore. If we ever did. So with that, this conversation.
Let me finish that last point. So there's number 1 is, who am I? The second question that the kid answers with the answer you just gave is, who are others like me? So when you are hanging out that village, that backyard, that masjid friends, that satiation can be answered with school friends who are others like me, because he can take a liking to things that they like, or he can take a liking to the masjid friends, and then they can be like, who are others like me? And the next question they are going to ask is, who do I follow? Who's the leader of the pack? Yeah. They're like wolves. They're trying to find a leader of the pack. And the last part is you have to activate them. What do I do? So now I have known my pack, my friends, my leader, which is Prophet ﷺ for all of us. But what do I do? And that's where the activist Muslims come in, right? But if you go into activism without having answered the first 3 questions, that's problematic. Right. Yeah. And if you don't activate and you just answer these questions, that becomes a problem, because now you don't have anything. And I'm talking about beyond coming to 5 times a prayer in the masjid. That's a given if you get to that level, or even 2 prayers in the masjid. I'm talking about, what do you need to do in the community to be a Muslim so you feel like you're doing something, you're giving back? Do you want to adopt a park? Do you want to do something? And that's why churches focus so much on activism and this act, and not so much on the identity part, but like so much on this element. And I think that's a part and parcel of this society. Again, this is a longer conversation, but really appreciate the time for giving me the opportunity to speak. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless this channel and whatever you guys do at Yaqeen Institute. And hopefully we can do some more interesting topics on Aqidah and this who am I is a very big thing. Like, how do Muslims find who am I, and where do they go, and how do they find that answer?
Definitely. Great stuff. No, a lot of really important threads opened up, and we thank you, Sheikh Ahmad Saleem, for, your generous time and contributing with your perspective and your insights. And we look forward to working together in the future. Barakallahu feekum.
Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Join us next week as we have a very special guest, Wahid Jensen, who's going to take us into the life of somebody who is trying to deal with their same-sex attraction, but remain pious and an observant Muslim and fight against that attraction. It promises to be a very enlightening episode.